Well, thanks, Sid. Kind of like you said, my focus on this is a little bit different, more from an OEM perspective of how can OEMs be part of the lifecycle solution and what changes do we need to make. So we're going to grab a little bit from the earlier session today on where we're at and what do we really need as vendors to push IoT security across the entire product line. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a perspective of where did our process start when I went from an engineer over to the dark side or security, or depending on which side of the table you're sitting on, going backwards. But where are we going with the security part, and why aren't we getting better at it? This is one of my favorite quotes out there. This is from Cesar Sfruto from IOActive. And his quote that really sticks with me is, "I see the same problems over and over again, and we're just not getting better." And that's something, especially now in a consultancy role, that I see, and from an OEM perspective, I saw over and over again. But what is it that's really driving this inefficiency? Why are we not getting better? Individuals are getting better. We're getting training. Individual products are getting better. Individual companies are getting better. But for the whole of the ecosystem here, for the whole of IoT, why are we repeating the same mistakes? So like I said, we're kind of going to walk through a little bit of that engineering process and try and gain a little bit of insight on the engineering mentality that's kind of keeping us stuck in this bucket and how do we get out of it. So when I started at Caterpillar, I was a junior comms engineer. I worked on our onboard embedded products, mostly for information gathering or diagnostic prognostics and onboard. So life was good. Everything was serial. Our data links were serial. I was there when we had our first embedded Ethernet device. And that Ethernet device came with a little tag on it that said, "This is not meant to be connected to the internet. This is so you can download your machine data faster." So we put that out on a customer site, came back 3 months later to visit it and see how they were doing. And there was a Sierra wireless modem, hanging off the end of it. I said, "Guys, what's that?" And he said, "Well, we figured out pretty quick that instead of sending a guy out to the truck, we could just hang this off the edge of it and it'd be a whole lot easier. We can get our data faster." So we took that back to our management at CAT and they said, "Wow, that's terrible. We should do that. That should be our next business model." And that's where telematics came from, especially from the industrial side. We went from what were 8-bit microcontrollers into 32-bit microprocessors, right? We went from hard-coded C to embedded Linux. And so we picked up all the open source from Linux, all the open source bugs from Linux, and all of the update mechanisms from Linux. And how do you get this on an IoT device that's 240 tons empty and 500 tons loaded? And how do you make that a secure product? From an engineering perspective, it was very interesting to go, from the engineering process, you go and here's my requirements. My requirements are to make the machine work. And by the way, I have to get data off board. The engineers aren't focused on what else can someone do with that machine? What else can we do now that we've had this new entry point to it? So getting that from an end-to-end security solution from telematics was a very large growth process for Caterpillar. Started at the onboard and now we've got an office suite to back it up. Went outside of Caterpillar for a couple of years to a vendor that worked mostly on Caterpillar and oil and gas. And we were focused on the same thing. How do you get data off the machines? How do you bring value from that data back to customers? And how do you do it securely? And as a product line manager and eventually a CISO for that line, I started to have a lot of conversations with executives, especially in IoT areas. What is it that you're looking for? And every one of them said, well, we definitely need to get data off the machines, but it has to be secure. And we found out really quick they didn't know what has to be secure meant. The questions that were behind it, what does that actually mean? What does that process look like? How do I actually protect it? This is a new area for them as well, and they don't have a good set of requirements to go give to a vendor and say, hey, these are requirements I need you to meet if we're getting in here. So back to Caterpillar, I actually came back a few years later as a security architect for all the autonomy programs. And the interesting learning perspective here was going back, and now I was doing architecture reviews, security reviews, and actually assessments on the same engineering groups that I had been a part of when I started. And so the real light bulb for me went off when I had to go back and help these folks understand the difference between the engineering and the security engineering, and really help get that vocabulary between the two the same. I had a real good knockdown drag out with one of the guys who I think is one of the best engineers at Caterpillar. He was all excited and red in the face and said, my program absolutely is secure. It cannot do what you're telling me it can do. We don't build it to do that way. My program doesn't work that way. And I said, you know what, you're right. You did a great job with that program. That's going to be really hard for me to get around, so I'm not going to use your program. I'm just going to write hex direct to the data link and I can write whatever I want. And he went from very red to very white in a pretty short amount of time there. And it's just that mentality of the adversarial mindset that we pick up in security, and how to get that back into the engineering staff. How to get the folks to realize that just because you met your requirements, you have your use cases and your corner cases down, that doesn't change the way your product reacts now that someone else has the ability to go up and change it. So it ended up being more of a consulting role anyway, so we went and did that full time. But basically, what we're looking for here is, how do we make that change different? How do we catch up from the security perspective, and what does that look like going forward? And I think that's training in the engineering side. Our product engineers aren't going to be security experts, and it's not going to benefit us to make them security experts. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, security isn't taught in engineering development programs. You're taught, again, to make sure that you meet your requirements and your device acts like you expect it to. I think we need to start using those education opportunities and help teaching folks to understand not only the maker mentality, but also the converse of that, and being able to look at an adversarial perspective and say, here's the easiest point for someone to come in and change my application. So my hope is that we all do outreach in different programs, but through SANS Institute for folks who are in their career, but even back to university level for folks that are aspiring engineers. And I think if we push it back that far in the process, that's the only way we're ever going to move the yardstick forward and be able to actually get ahead of the IoT security issues.